I'm Sheila Kuehl, and as usual, I will be your, I don't know, what shall I say, gracious hostess through the next hour, because we have a great show for you for this month and hopefully beyond. Every so often, as you might know, we do a one-on-one interview with a person who has made an enormous difference in the world and a member of our community. We call it Voices of Our Lives. And today we are very fortunate to have as our guest Patti Giggans. She's the executive director of Peace Over Violence, which for many years was known as the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women. But her story is variegated and interesting and wonderful, and I'm so glad you're here. Hi, Patti.
Hi, Sheila.
Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So I think, having been your friend for such a long time, a lot about your life sort of since I met you. But it's always a curiosity to me how people make the decisions they do and, end up being leaders in our community, being leaders in society, and really working to make a difference instead of working to make $1 million, which I wish you were making, but, we'll give it to the organization instead. So if you don't mind, let's go way back to the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New York, on Long Island.
Long Island?
On Long Island.
What was that like?
Kind of version of Little Italy on Long Island.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It was, this was growing up in the 50s and in the 60s. An amazing time in my history. I feel like I'm such a child of those times.
But the 50s were very different from the 60s, though. So what was childhood like for you? Your folks, etc., your family?
I grew up in a family. We had an Italian family, Italian-American family. My grandparents had come over from Italy.
Uh-huh.
So my parents were born in America. And we had an Italian restaurant.
Oh, yeah?
Which my dad to this day still has.
Really?
And I grew up in the restaurant business in a way, In fact, my whole family did. We all kind of worked different jobs there. And in high school, my dad was always so kind to my friends. He'd give them all jobs working in the restaurant.
It was probably good for him, too, right?
Right.
So what was your childhood like? You have siblings, or?
I have a brother and two sisters.
Uh-huh.
And so it was interesting because the community that I grew up in was divided into several communities. It was somewhat segregated, actually, back then. And so, like the Italians were in one neighborhood and African Americans in another and Jews in another and Protestants in another. But then everybody went to the same high school, so there was this crossing over at the same time that there was these different neighborhoods. So early on I had a kind of consciousness of that. What is that about?
Mm-hmm. That's separation, you mean?
Yeah, that's separation. And,
well, you actually had an experience in your first school, right? Or when your mother was, as I recall, something.
My mother was had her own ideas. She always was she said, I'm the black sheep of the family, because she always had a lot of her own original ideas. And she was not able to go to college. In fact, she had to quit high school. Was forced to quit high school to take care of her younger siblings. So when my brother and I came along, she just programmed us that we were going to go to college. She set it out that her kids were going to have a college education. And so she whispered into our ears since we were babies, you're going to college. And so here was, so I'm in elementary school, getting ready to graduate, going to high school, and you're kind of picked to go into whether it's the college course or the more technical or business. And because of my last name, an Italian last name.
What was your last?
Occhiuso.
Occhiuso.
This counselor that had come to the school that didn't even know me, just kind of randomly marks down to put me in this technical.
And trade school kind of stuff.
Trade school,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I go home with this piece of paper, and I was confused. My mom went through the roof. She goes marching down to the school and said, why did you do this? Aren't you looking at my child's grades and what we say we want for her? Are you going by this last name? And that was a lesson for me, of course, And my mom periodically would, storm the barricades about something to do with, particularly with her kids or with the family. So I kind of saw that. She was an advocate that way.
Mm-hmm. So you had a lesson in advocacy early.
Early on.
But wasn't there an issue where you were supposed to go to one school and your mom wanted you to go to another school?
Well, no, not really. We moved. There was an issue of moving out of a neighborhood and wanting to finish the school. So I wound up living my last 2 years of high school. I lived at a friend's house during the week to go to school, so I could finish my high school.
And did you make your mother happy and go to college?
I did.
Where'd you go?
I did. I went to the University of Buffalo, SUNY at Buffalo.
So what years are we talking about now? Things are heating up activism-wise?
Yes. In fact, UB was known as the Berkeley of the East.
The Berkeley of the East.
Yes,
Why was that?
Oh, there was a lot of social activism. SDS was big on campus. I remember marching against HUAC.
The House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah, exactly. And then I had this experience, another little illuminating thing that I've never forgotten. When I was schooled, at that time, all of us were impacted by the civil rights movement, early on, and watching on television, and people being cattle prodded and dogs, and all that, trying to have integration happen, and all that consciousness coming up. And so here I'm at the University of Buffalo, and there's this activism, and the Vietnam War is starting to really build up, and so I went into girlfriend and I went into a meeting of SDS. We thought, okay, let's go find out what that's about. So we listened, and there were just very few women in this meeting. They were mostly men. So at the end of the meeting, everybody was getting their marching orders. Okay, you go do this, you go make signs, and you go write a petition, and you go write a resume, and you go do whatever. And then they told us, would we please go do the Xeroxing?
The girls.
The girls. Well, we left the meeting, and they never got their Xeroxing done by us. That was like, we said, no, we're not doing the Xeroxing. Because at that point, feminism was starting to... The idea
right, there was something sort of trickling into our consciousness,
right?
The
little stuff was kind of seeping into the community, and so that was again a very interesting experience.
But there was very little gay consciousness at the time, even when the women's movement was starting. I remember many of them were very worried that there would be, lesbians in it, because that would give the movement a bad name, or you could minimize it or something. So in terms of your own sexuality, did you have any inklings?
I didn't, and I didn't even know any lesbians. And if they were lesbians that I knew, I didn't know they were lesbians.
Right, right.
And that's all through college, actually. It was a kind of at a distance. But I remember when I was married and I was living in Greenwich Village, a kind of another awakening in terms of politics was I lived in the West Village, and Stonewall was down the street.
Oh, sure.
And I was there. I watched that happen in the streets of Greenwich Village.
Wow.
So there was all this politics and beginnings of movements, and I was paying attention to a lot of it.
And so did the activism appeal to you? I mean, I'm always interested in sort of what it is that pushes people along the way, because 99% of people are not activists. They don't necessarily feel like, oh, I've just got to spend my life working, to make things better for other people, or civil rights, or whatever. There's just something that guides us along.
I really think I am such a child of those times. I did go along, and I was doing a lot of thinking, and I was educating myself, and I was moved to act, to get involved, to protest. And so it was like, I do feel like I'm a child of the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the feminist movement, and then later on, the gay liberation movement.
Right. So here you are in college in Buffalo, and what did you go straight through, or how did that unfold for you?
I took some time. I had it in my head that I wanted to go to Europe, and I wanted to give a break from. There was some things going on in my family, divorcing in the family, and I just wanted to get away. And I thought, I'm going to go to Europe. Of course, my family looks at me. When they think back at some of the things I thought about, they think, where did she come from? But so I did. I kind of made my own junior year abroad. So I left school and had the money in my pocket, and when my money was going to run out, I was going to have to come home. So I got on the SS France and left from New York and went to Le Havre in Paris and decided to stay and have Paris be my home base. And I traveled, went to museums and started to take French classes at the Sorbonne. And that was another life-changing experience. I met students from all over the world. This was an amazing experience, Sheila. You would have loved this. You would have said this, actually, had you been there. If you'd been the professor. We're in this big amphitheater at the University of Paris. You're one of the oldest in the world. And all of us foreign students, because it's a course for foreigners from all over the world. And this man comes walking in with these black robes and this hat, and he says, "Bienvenue, citoyens du monde." Welcome, citizens of the world. And it was like all the light bulbs in my head went off. You know, I said, "Yeah, that's what I am. That's what I want to be. That's what I want to be." You know? And I traveled, and I'm very grateful for the travel that I have done in my life. And I've had a chance to live abroad, live in France. I've lived in Asia. I got to live in Vietnam and visited many countries, and that's really important to me.
Well, something else happened on the boat on the way over, I think, right?
Yes, I met my future husband.
You did. Tell us about him.
Yeah, I met the man that I was eventually to marry, and it was, it was like, again, one of these meant-to-bes. And it was great because we had some similar values around the kind of family that we wanted to have. We both loved travel. We were interested in languages, and he was already speaking French, and I was still struggling to learn French. And then eventually he became a journalist, a broadcast journalist. And we got to go and
So you guys were living in Paris?
Well, then we were just students.
Oh, right, as students in Paris.
Students. And later on, after that, we came back to the States and got married.
Because you said you were married and living in Greenwich Village. Was that
Yes.
before you went to Vietnam?
Yes.
Yeah, so talk about that for a minute, because you mentioned Stonewall, and it sounds like a fairly interesting time in Greenwich Village.
It was very, very interesting. And at the same time, like, there was, they called it, women's liberation at the time. The movement was starting, and I remember having a consciousness-raising group in my living room.
Of women who were
just talking. Friends and colleagues from work. I was working at the Department of Social Services for New York City as a caseworker then. And so we had consciousness-raising groups there, and that was an important thing to do.
What do you think developed in you because of that?
Well, it was really interesting for women talking together. I think that was the big thing, and really talking about our lives and seeing the commonalities among the differences from different backgrounds.
And was there any mention at that time about abuse or?
A little bit, yes. Exactly. People had begun to talk about that in my groups, and then of course we're reading and looking at the feminist literature and finding out that all over the country women are meeting together and talking about the sexual violence, the domestic violence, things they witnessed in their families. Little by little, those secrets were coming out, and that was like I think for me, became an important part of my feminism. I became more like an anti-violence feminist in a way, because there were equality feminists or feminists who were going to work on this, you were going to work on that. So, for me, that's what compelled me, and then of course I stuck with that over the years.
Yes, of course you did, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But tell me a little bit more about Stonewall, because you said you were in the village.
Yeah, it was kind of happening. All of a sudden, it was happening, and I was fairly ignorant of anything preceding. Maybe I just knew a little bit, and so it was a very dramatic thing. The riots were happening, right down the block from where I lived, and a lot of people were waking up to, what is this grievance about? Who are these people who are protesting and are complaining about police brutality and how they're being treated and rights that they don't have? And so, of course, here I was beginning to really think about that in terms of women, and so then, of course, like other people, I'm making the connection.
Mm-hmm.
So with
Oppression
civil
of one
rights-
group and the
exactly.
relationship to oppression of the other groups.
Exactly.
Right.
And civil rights and human rights.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting continuum. I mean, it wasn't perfectly sort of chronological, but my awareness of the civil rights work kind of from outside, as you seeing it on TV, although I went to Birmingham accidentally for a television show, and we were in the middle of a bunch of stuff in '63, you know, and then the women's movement, and then hearing about Stonewall, not quite getting, you know, what was going on, but thinking about it kind of takes you along a kind of a path. But then Jim, African American, right? And he was in public relations, I think you said, and then you said broadcast journalism.
Yes, yes.
So was he recruited to?
Well, it was right during 1968
Mm-hmm.
with all the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, there were really no African American broadcasters or news people.
Uh-huh.
You know, very little on television at all, and in the field, in the industry at all. You know, and Jim he's always been interested in writing and film and documentary, and so he actually got in touch and said, you know, maybe I could be useful here. And he got offered a job and with ABC News and started a new career for him.
You know, I had never really thought about it. It's funny how you're not conscious until you are. Watching all the broadcasts about the assassination of Dr. King. And, of course, my consciousness is not high enough really yet, but white face after white face after white face, where was the comment? Oh, there might be a community person. They'd ask, you know, what do you think happened, et cetera. But you're right. It would make it very different.
Right. And it changed after that. I mean, there was struggles all along the way to make that change, to have more people of color on television in general, and specifically also, you know, obviously with broadcast.
So is that how you guys ended up in Vietnam?
And exactly, that's how, because Jim then got an assignment to go to Vietnam as
And was
a war correspondent.
United States was already in Vietnam.
Right, we're talking 1970 at this point. You know,
So he was a war correspondent.
Yes.
And you went with him.
And I went with him. And the news company didn't really want me to go. They wanted me to either stay back in the States or hide out in Hong Kong or Singapore. And I thought, you know, we hadn't been married that long. I said, no way. If you're going, I'm going. And we went. And again, an amazing, extraordinary experience.
Say more about that time.
Yeah, we lived in Vietnam, in Saigon, for about two and a half years. And Jim was, you know, riding in those helicopters and following the infantry and doing all kinds of stories. And little by little, at that point, the troops were starting to come home.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was doing was volunteering at a couple of orphanages, and you're going to laugh when I say this, but kind of organized a consciousness raising group in my apartment in downtown Saigon with this crazy crew of us women from different walks of life, different countries, and we would, you know, sit around talking. And then, of course, some of them were wives of journalists, some of them were related to the military, working for the military. I remember there was a stewardess, there were journalists, actual stringer journalists who were part of it, and again, it was fascinating. And it was a kind of a expatriate group, and it helped ground us, actually, that group. I remember fondly all of those women, and we were talking about some of the, you know, things. You live in a foreign country, and how do you fit in? What do you do? How do you manage? And it was a war. You know,
It's hard to be grounded in a war.
Exactly.
It's the craziest time.
Exactly.
I was there only for 4 weeks in '69 with the USO, and it seemed to me to be like being Alice in Wonderland, not where it wasn't Wonderland. It was more like Warland, you know. Very different, very ungrounded. So I can see where you'd need to have a kind of an anchor.
Yeah. And Jim was doing a lot of stories on the orphans, you know, the collateral damage of war.
Right, the sort of biracial children from the soldiers.
Exactly. And so I was volunteering, doing some work in some of the orphanages. And so, you know, we decided that maybe we would start our family, and we would start, and we would adopt a child, and we adopted our first child there, and
So how old was she when you adopted her?
she was about 3.5 months old.
Wow.
3.5 months old, and she's Vietnamese and African American mixture.
It's quite a commitment in the middle of a war to adopt a
Yeah,
child. You were
yeah.
you were staying in Saigon. You weren't just taking Allie and leaving, right?
No, and we couldn't leave. Or we could
because
leave,
of her.
but she couldn't leave.
Aha.
So, and we didn't know how that would work out, and how long the papers would take for us to have permission to, have the adoption in hand so that we could leave. But and that's part of the reason we stayed as long as we did, so that we could leave with Allie.
Mm-hmm.
And we went. We were fortunate that Jim's posting after Saigon was Paris, which was a dream to go back, and
Sure.
since that's where we met, to go back and live in Paris.
So you went back with Allie.
Went back with Allie and lived in Paris for about 7 years.
Wow. And what did you do while you were there?
There, I started training in the martial arts.
Why was that?
Well, I always had another thing. There's a crazy idea I had in the back of my head that I wanted to learn some self-defense.
Uh-huh.
And I was often interested when I was a kid in reading about Buddhism and Zen and that kind of, a little bit of martial arts. I kind of had this interest at an early age.
So is this a sort of an integration thing? I mean, I'm talking about self, kind of. Because I think of it, when you talk about Buddhism and Zen, and then you talk about martial arts, I'm not, obviously, sure, what's the connection?
Well, there is a kind of meditative and also a philosophical basis of, particularly the Japanese martial arts, and also the Chinese martial arts. There's a spiritual component to the practice, absolutely, and it was also because at that point too, we were thinking more about trying to pay more attention to our bodies and who we were, and certainly it's a body art, it's a movement art, it's a martial art, and there were very few women who were doing it. I was one of the first women in the States to get a black belt, as a matter of fact. Well,
really?
I got my black belt in Paris.
Uh-huh.
And so I started training a little bit while I was living in Saigon. I was studying some Taekwondo, and then when I moved to Paris, I switched over to Japanese-style martial arts, and that's where I got my black belt. And then I started teaching a class for women because my own instructor, my sensei, asked me one day, he said, "How come you're always the only woman in the class?" And I said, "Because I have a hard head." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the other ones come and go because it's not easy to be here. It's not welcoming. This is not a welcoming environment for women to train." And he had the idea. He gave me this idea, which changed my life. He says, "Why don't you teach women, and then maybe they'll hang out and they'll stay and they can benefit." So under his auspices, I opened a class for women. And I started to, in a way, him as my mentor, learned how to teach martial arts to others. And so when I came back to the States, a few years after that, I started Karate Women's School here in Los Angeles. Karate Women's School for women and karate kids.
But how did you end up in California?
Well, after Paris, we came back. We returned to the United States, and Jim began to work here in Los Angeles.
Uh-huh. So you opened a school for, a whole school, not just a class. Your own school to train women in the martial arts and young people.
Yes, and we had Karate Kids before the movie. We were the first Karate Kids.
They stole it from you, but you never sued.
Part of the reason I did that is I wanted my own kids to be able to learn.
Sure.
Some of what the martial arts has to offer, And that was it was a fantastic experience. And so I had a teacher here in Los Angeles, a karate teacher, James Field, and he was another mentor. I had some wonderful male mentors because I wouldn't have been able to have done it because there were no women. I didn't have a women teacher. There are women now who have only had women teachers. But when I was coming up through the ranks, I only had male teachers.
Right. That was the case in a lot of professions, actually.
And exactly, and in a lot of professions, you have to come steal the knowledge and kind of snoop around to get the skills.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really grateful to my martial arts teachers because they, for some reason, they wanted to teach me. Maybe they knew that I really wanted to learn,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so it was a real gift. I'll always be grateful for
And
that.
you must have also gained some business skills. I mean, you're essentially running your own business, right?
Yes.
Which has probably stood you in good stead in the 501c3.
Because we weren't a nonprofit, but we didn't make very much profit like Karate Women's Commercial.
Nonprofit. I know. I had a law practice like that.
It was through that, because then I was teaching self-defense at West LA College, at Santa Monica College, and I was teaching karate. I taught the karate class at Santa Monica College.
Oh, yeah?
And I was running my school. And the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women heard about me through my self-defense.
Which was not an LA city thing. It was a 501c3, right?
Yeah,
the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women.
Exactly.
So they asked you to teach?
They asked me to come and help retrain some of their self-defense instructors.
Huh.
And that's how I got involved with LaCaw in the 80s.
So you went to teach a class, and then what?
And then I became a volunteer on the hotline and became part of the advisory board. And then I got hired on as a staff person. And after that, I became the executive director. So I kind of, you know, and I started to move into more and more work with the commission. Eventually, I gave up my karate school, and it was taken over by some senior students.
And were you divorced by now?
At that point, yeah, separated and then divorced.
So
change is in the air.
Change is in the air, and a lot of making tracks, absolutely. But your sexuality must have been something that you discovered was either different than what you thought, or the same along a spectrum, or what happened there?
Well, you know, it's so interesting. Of course, it's kind of like a really, you know, surprised myself. Big surprise. But it's like the way I look at it is value added. That's the way I look at it.
Say more.
Say more. I think the idea of, well, for me, it's like I'm not, you know, I don't like to get stuck too much in categories, you know, that you have to be this way, and then you're not that way anymore, then you're this way, you know. You know, I think there is a kind of continuum and ebbs and flows and kind of a natural, you know, and you know, when you fall in love, you fall in love.
Right.
You know, you can't discount that.
Well, it is sort of strange in a way because, for instance, you married an African-American man. That didn't make you an African-American.
No.
I mean, it's not required, you know, if you cross a line of somebody who's not you, and vice versa when you cross a line and somebody is like you. So in a way, if you were a Martian anthropologist like I am, you would say, well, no, this is not either this or that. It's simply me and who I fall in love with, which I think is what you just said. But how long have you been with Ellen?
28 years.
That's great. That's very good. So how did the two of you meet?
We met through the martial arts, actually. That's how we met.
She was a student?
Student. She was a student in my classes.
Now, had you already adopted your second child with Jim?
Yes,
or
yes.
Tell us about Chris.
My son Chris was born in Brazil.
Uh-huh.
And so we went down. We decided we wanted to expand our family.
Now, why Brazil?
And my brother lives in Brazil. He's lived there then and still lives there now. And he told us, you know, there's some possibilities if you're really seriously interested in expanding your family, and you owe me a visit, so why don't you come down
and pick up a kid?
Right, exactly. And that's what we did. You know? So he knew how to go through that process. He helped us through the process.
And Chris was actually just a newborn, right, when you got him?
Yes.
So there you are. You and Jim have two kids, both adopted. Doesn't work out for you. You separate. You meet Ellen, and now you're a family.
And now we have Ruby.
And now
So
you
now
have
we have
Ruby.
3 kids.
But that was a little later, right? I mean, you have 2 kids. You and Ellen get together. And then Ellen decides she wants to be the adoptive mother for somebody. So we get Ruby into the picture, who's now how old?
17.
17.
Right.
Wow. Well, it's a wonderful thing to build a family. And it strikes me that you've really kind of done the same thing at work in a very sort of different context. So let me follow that thread for a minute about LaCaw. What was it about the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women that drew you in? Because you said volunteer and then staff, and then they wanted you to be the executive director, which I know you've been for 30 years. So what was it about the mission or whatever? Because you weren't running it when you first got involved. What was it about?
You know, it's this question of violence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the issue. I mean, as I said, I was and still am an anti-violence feminist,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of been studying violence in terms of the way people treat each other and mistreat each other for my whole life. And I think part of what I discovered when I got to the commission was that I actually had been a witness to domestic violence, but I kind of put it way in the back of my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I, because my mother, in her second marriage, was a victim of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And even though when I started to get involved with the commission, that wasn't primary for me. It was more of this fascination that I've had about how, if we really want equality, how can women and girls have equality when there is the threat of violence, the reality of violence, all the time? So that's always been a fascinating thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've kind of stayed, you know, mostly on kind of, I love connecting the dots, and I'm very interested in how the dots need to be connected about all different kinds of violences and issues of oppression and equality, and
Mm-hmm.
inequality and equality. But I've kind of stayed on that, you know, as a focus. And I don't know if it was by accident, by design, by some other karma, but that has been my path. You know, when you start to ask me questions about this, then I realize, wow, I've been on that path for a while.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Well, my experience of you is that injustice makes you angry. Not always just in the giant sense of the word, but there's just, and you also are more, it seems to me, like a doer. Not that you're not a thinker and a planner and an analyzer, but you know,
Yeah.
it's like I experience you as there's something wrong. I want to, you know, do
Take
something
action.
about
I
it.
want to take action. I want
And
to do something.
it's yeah, and this just you cannot abide. This injustice of people having to suffer, children, women. It's at you know, it was the entry point for you. It seemed to me. So what was LaCaw like in those days? What did they do, and what did you do when you first started as executive director?
Right. It was the LA Rape and Battery Hotline.
Uh-huh.
You know, one of the first in the country.
Uh-huh.
And they had a self-defense program, which, you know, to me, that's also very active. So they had the intervention. People could call up, people could come in for counseling if they had been assaulted, raped, or battered, or suffered from child abuse. And on the other hand, they were asking me to come in to be in the community and teach self-defense, self-protection. And to me, that translates out as taking care of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
becoming empowered, and then in my warrior mind, then you're taking care of other people also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you are going to stand up against the bullies, and you're going to stand up against the bullies as an advocate for those who cannot stand up for themselves. So that self-defense piece really attracted me
Mm-hmm.
with LaCaw. You know, and that's how they snagged me in.
It was somewhat controversial, wasn't it? I maybe not. I think there was a discussion that I remember from the old days about whether you should fight back or not.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that?
Oh,
about
yes.
rape, whether you should just like go with it because you might get killed, or, you know, fight back. And I think, if I recall, you were on the fight back side, or at least be prepared,
Yes.
because that's what self-defense really was about, really.
Right. Do your best to fight back in all the ways that one can fight back. Not necessarily making a fist, but know how to make a fist.
Mm-hmm.
But if you chose not to do that for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
you know in your mind that you don't deserve this. You didn't ask for this. And you're going to remember what this person looks like after they're gone,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're going to recover from this. So So it's really participating in your own self-protection, taking action about your own safety, and it is a way of standing up for yourself, whether you ever make a fist or make contact and hit somebody. It's much deeper than that. And that's what we teach in self-defense to this day, in women's self-defense and in our empowerment classes. And a lot of people are trained and they never physically have to use it, but they're walking around the world as if they belong in the world. They're not shrinking, they're not hiding, they're not receding. They know they have a right to their presence in life. And that's really important, and it is really life-changing for a lot of people to begin to be asked to consider this for themselves.
Right. It's empowering. I mean, it's interesting how the more you learn about power, the more you learn how you don't have to use it necessarily.
People ask me all the time, "Oh, you had a black belt. Do you still practice?" And I say, "Do you use it? Did you ever use it?" I say, "I use it every day," and they look at me and they think, "Oh, I just have to fight everybody up. Right. Who did I beat up?" No, it's not about that at all. It is really about kind of embodying it. And hopefully, it doesn't mean that something's not going to happen to you. There's no guarantee, absolutely no guarantee. I don't believe there is any real safety in life. Something's going to happen, it's going to happen. But we have to be awake, we have to be alert, we have to participate.
Well, actually, there was a lot of scattered work going on in those days, it seemed to me, about sexual assault, about domestic violence. We had sort of coined the phrase, and nobody wanted to call it woman beating, which is, I think, what many of us kind of wanted. Like, let's call it what it is. But we got the nicer frame, domestic violence. But at least the word violence. But there were a lot of scattered work going on, and I think you began to participate in kind of pulling that together, because I think there was a organization. Say something about.
The different coalitions?
Yeah.
Like the Southern California Coalition for Battered Women and the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. A lot of the groups started to come together, in their fields of service and fields of interest. And then the movement really started to make a difference once the organizations really started to work together,
Well, I remember we had to work together to find the real language we wanted to put in the law. I mean, there was only going to be one bill, about making this a crime. We all had to agree on kind of what it would be. But sexual assault and domestic violence still were pretty separate, and in many cases still really are.
Right. And I still, and you were involved all those years, and you did such important work, Sheila. But I always still join it. In my mind, it's violence against women and girls, and this isn't to leave out the violence that happens, to men and to boys at all, but there is that focus because of the historical context. Gender-based violence doesn't answer every question about how humans harm each other or why, but it's a big piece of the violence, and those are the hidden violences. So I still think about it as violence against women as an issue together. There's sexual violence, there's domestic violence, there's stalking, It's like you can deconstruct it, but I think it's important to think about it as a movement, that what we're trying to do is have women have less violence happen to them, have children have less violence happen to them, have men and boys have less violence happen to them.
Well, that was an interesting development. I mean, there have been many at LaCaw, and we'll talk about the name change in just a minute, but it seemed to me every time I talked to you, you would be having an idea about a connection with something else in society that could be brought into this concept. I mean, I've seen the through line of violence against women, as you say. It's a core issue, even today. But you began to see that there was kind of more that could be brought in. And I think even before you guys changed your name to Peace Over Violence, that you were talking about men and boys and even gangs, if I recall.
Yes, exactly.
Tell me about how your thinking connected these things.
Right, because I do call it connecting the dots, and how all these violences, for us to really challenge the amount of violence, and want to change the culture of violence, the institutions that where violence is inhabited, is to not have gang violence be in a silo over here, and institute state violence like in prisons, what the government might do, or racism and homophobia, all of those, and economics. If we all can't work on all of those things at the same time. I totally get that, and I know I can't, but I think it's important that we connect with each other, and we try to make those alliances and coalitions, and show up for each other. Those of us who are activists try to show up for each other on these issues, and try to find the connecting points and what are the commonalities.
Well, the LGBT community, I think, struggled with what to do about this violence issue for a while, because it was hard for people to say, well, it's gender-based violence, because it would be men beating up men, or women beating up women. Although there was some role issues, I think, that would enter into it, but not always. And there have been some complaints that the violence against women movement didn't sort of embrace the issues of violence in our community. Was that an issue for LaCaw, one way or another, or?
It was. I mean, I'm aware of the some of the philosophical bumps and the ideological bumps that have come out of this. And as I said, the gender-based approach or perspective does not answer all the questions.
Right.
But I don't think it answers it for all of them, because I feel like we have to evolve. And I use the term value added. This is where I've gotten in my life. And, it's like I add on. I don't subtract that much, but I make room to add on. And so I think what I've been able to do is help our organization have a broader view, have a bigger view. And so yes, we believe that their gender-based violence and the feminist perspective is still very valuable, and does answer and helps do some of the work that we need to do. At the same time, the public health model is also very valuable. The fact is, we do participate in the criminal justice model, holding abusers accountable, and because that's kind of a runaway model that we have to be careful with. But and the law, and that's an important piece of it. And I don't think we're done. And then the oppression model, and power and privilege. I don't think we're done thinking about this and figuring out, because it doesn't come in a nice little box you can tie it up with a bow. Humans don't function that way in our interactions.
Well, is that why you wanted to change the name? Because LA Commission on Assaults Against Women, people thought, of course, expansive, feminist, whatever. Always thought it included children, because where you have women, we have taking care of children, blah blah. But you had a larger vision for the group. Talk about that.
Right. Yeah. I think what happened is that, first of all, we were growing over years. 30, 35 years. Where we changed our name. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary. Peace Over Violence, formerly LaCaw, and it's the 40th anniversary of the Violence Against Women's movement, this iteration in the United States, right? So when we changed our name 5 years ago, it was because we had outgrown this idea of that's all we were about. We wanted to be able to open it up to make more connections, and we wanted to have a name that was for something. We're always so against things. And I think this is part of the evolving, if we're going to be an evolving movement, if we're going to be an evolving civilization as human beings, as humanity, we wanted to have a name that was what we were aspiring to, and so we came up with Peace Over Violence, which was a nice umbrella. And I remember, Sheila, you said, "Oh, you're changing your name is because you don't want women in your name anymore." I remember. We got no.
Only good friends can challenge you on this matter.
No, but people said it was legitimate. It took us a
Right.
long time to change the name.
Right.
We had a 2-year process at the agency, making sure that everybody sat with this idea. You know, what is this new name going to be? How is it going to feel? What does it mean? Is it really expressing who we are now? We really, we took it on. That was not like, oh, let's just change the name, you know. We really thought about it a lot with our volunteers and our staff and our board and the community, and we're very happy with it. And, part of it was so interesting. At that point, we had working a lot with youth. We were working with gangs, gang prevention. And we were part of the California Wellness Foundation's 12-year violence prevention initiative, which was extraordinary in the state of California, really put violence prevention, out there as an issue. And we were part of that, So we were changing. We had a lot of youth involved with us. And so when we started to talk about changing the name, a lot of our young men said, "What? You're going to take LaCaw away from us?" They were kind of used to it.
Well, they were also modeling not being violent against girls.
Exactly.
And not being violent, that real manhood was a whole new idea, that real manhood involved not hitting people. And that was a real evolution for many of the young men in your program, I know.
Absolutely, and it's fantastic, because these high school students, these adolescents, these young men are taking this on.
Mm-hmm.
They want to figure it out.
Right.
And they don't see themselves so much as models. But they're starting to use the term leader. That they want. Yeah, I want to be a leader at violence prevention. And we're helping them do that.
Right. Well, it's also a great branding opportunity. I mean, you have done blank over violence with everybody you can take pictures of,
Well, don't you think peace over violence is an idea whose time has come?
It really is. It really is. Although an old idea too. I mean, you can go, I'm sure, farther back than Gandhi.
Yeah.
But the notion that there's something, and it's the same thing you're also talking about in self-defense, where you never use it, or you don't need to use it, that there is something inside. And I always thought of it as, T.S. Eliot called it the still point. Kind of like, when a wheel goes around, it looks like the axle's just staying still, which I think is what he was talking about in his poetry. But that same idea of quietude is equal to peace in a way, like peace over the violence in my own person, in my own life. I actually have come to think quite a bit of the name of your organization and think about it. Although I think the poster in your kitchen with your picture that says "Pasta over Violence," this is perhaps going too far, but it was pretty good.
Well, we have to nurture.
Yes, of course.
And we have to eat.
And food, coming from a restaurant family.
Absolutely.
Now, you won a Peace Prize, did you not?
I did. I got the Peace Prize from the California Wellness Foundation. That was great.
Yeah.
That was great.
What did they say it was for?
That. And this was one of those where you don't even know you're nominated.
Uh-huh.
You get this call, and they tell you, they called me and said, I was shocked, what? It was for my work with sexual and domestic violence and youth.
Right.
And the work of the agency, not just my work. It's it was really for all of us at the time LaCaw.
So what's the next growth spurt or expansion or whatever?
When we changed our name to Peace Over Violence, little by little, more men had been calling who were abused as children, molested as children, sexually assaulted, and right now we're in this.
We're seeing a lot
very big discovery
period
with Penn State and Syracuse University.
And the Boy Scouts.
The Boy Scouts. This is big right now. This is going to be one of those silos that, breaks apart. I believe that Penn State will be to male-child sexual abuse and child abuse in general, and particularly males, but both girls and boys, to what OJ was to domestic violence. This teaching moment, this movement moment, and the secrets are going to come out. You know, when I look back at my life, and I know you can relate to this, Sheila, all those years of work that you've done with in violence prevention and intervention, and is that it's like secrets have to come out. You know, it's those closet doors have got to open. The windows have to open. And I think we've been on that path. I'm this iteration of life, you know, where I've been on Earth. It's like I'm really grateful for it because we've been able to witness that.
Mm-hmm.
The breaking down of the barriers, the breaking of the secrets, the opening up, an unfolding. It's a good time.
It is a good time, but I think your work has done so much to make it safe to tell those secrets. And it's the same thing really in the community. We, you know, when Gene O'Leary and Rob Eichmann invented National Coming Out Day, it was a way of saying, let's pick one day a year and come out to everybody you can think of. And it was stunning, really, what happened when people started coming out. It was a very, very difficult individual decision
Mm-hmm.
to tell the secret. But one of the things I found, and I don't know if it's the same with you, Patti, is when I told my secret, somebody would then tell me back a secret. Now, it wasn't necessarily that they were gay, too, but something
It's a lot of things.
had
It's
happened.
about violence. Yeah, you know, this
could be
happened
about
to me.
violence, could be about their mother, could be about alcoholism, could be about good things, but I mean something they had just discovered or something they wanted to tell, a story of their own, you know, telling. So what's the next area for Peace Over Violence?
Well, what we're doing now is we are a couple areas of growth, and I like to think of not just growth but depth for us. Is we have a center downtown, and my dream was for us to have our name on the building. We don't own the building; we're renting, which is fine. But we, you know, downtown LA, as you drive down Wilshire Boulevard, there's Peace Over Violence that lights up at night, and behind it are the skyscrapers of our wonderful city, you know. And so we're expanding into the suite next door to create a children and youth center.
Huh.
And this is our newest big idea.
Wonderful.
And we're going to be able to have a lot of the students that come from the local high schools who come out and hang out at our office after school.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have a space right next door for them, you know, kind of teen loungy area. And we're also going to be dealing with children who are witnesses to domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And also children we already deal with children who are sexually assaulted, but we're going to have a much nicer, welcoming space for that to go on. And it's going to be expansion. Our goal is to be able to intervene and prevent violence across the lifespan. So we've been doing it with the teenagers and adults and elders,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're going to be doing it with the under 11 years old.
Hmm.
We're adding that component, and I'm really excited about it. I don't want to retire until we get that done.
Retire, Patti Giggans, retired. I never heard those in the same sentence, and I don't know whether I will. You deserve it, whatever you want to do.
No, I have no intention of retiring. My father is still working in his restaurant. He's 88 years old, and he's running his restaurant. And, you know, I figure I have a long way to go.
Well, I feel the same way. And it's interesting what you said. It's a good time in life, and I don't know that you meant that everything is going fabulously, because, you know, we look at the world and we look at our country and we look at, you know, even our cities, our campuses. Things are not going well, but people are finding their voice, just like, you know, 30, 40 years ago. We were feeling like we were finding our voice, being able to articulate sort of that's another kind of secret, where we all keep society secret. You know, whether it's the top 1% or whether it's the incredible amount of violence that was going on when everyone said, oh, well, it's just a few women. And we had to break that open. So it is a very good time in life.
It is.
Now, you also have a new project that you personally get to embark on, I think.
Yes, I've been, well, I just want to say one other thing I want to
Please.
talk about that, but I just want to say that we're also very excited. Peace Over Violence is part of the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities. So we're working in South LA and in Boyle Heights, working with youth in particular. in those areas. So, you know, my board would love to have like Peace Over Violence youth centers all over the place. And they'd be very happy if we could do that. But it is getting this idea of peace over violence and joining with other organizations, you know, and work on these issues and build this leadership. We want to build a leadership where young people are empowered to use their voice. And the other thing I want us, and I also have to check myself on this, we also have to listen. We can't just be telling our own secrets and becoming empowered in telling our stories. We have to be able to make sure that we're listening to each other and taking that there's a mutuality. Otherwise, it's like, you know, there's this cacophony going on. We gotta
that's where the learning goes on.
Stories. We have to do something with these stories.
Well, that's where you learn too, in listening to other people. Although sometimes I do find that when I articulate something, I'm learning from myself because I didn't even know I thought that before.
Right.
You know, you put it into a sentence and you go, that's it. Now exactly. I've got it. Made it come out of my mouth.
I'm the same way. When I say it out loud, it's like, oh yeah, like the light bulb goes up. That's what I meant.
Right.
Now I know what I mean.
Right.
But I'm going to work on this project. I've just been awarded a Stanton Fellowship from the Durfee Foundation, and what the goal of the Stanton Fellowship is to allow a leader to take a little time away from work, which they will support, so that you can do some thinking and some research and some work on an intractable problem. So of course I've been working on this intractable problem of violence against women and children for, you know, my whole life, and so I presented them with this idea that I would like to have a little time away from work, because what intrigues me now, after 40 years of the violence against women's movement, is we haven't solved the problem. And there's a lot of violence. I mean, at our center, I just got a call from one of my staff saying we need to hire another counselor. We need more help. You know. So there is a tremendous amount of sexual and domestic violence and child abuse still, you know. And so my question is, what do we do for the next 40 years? Where do we go? What has to change? And I want to ask questions that are really going to get people to think about, have we, even as a movement, as activists, have we even created things that are now in our way? What have been the unintended consequences of some of the laws and public policy that we've created? You know, so I'm going to take some time away from work and talk to other people. I'm going to set up some mini think tanks, get some groups of people. I want to get the usual advocates and activists and leaders.
The next generation of consciousness.
But I want to get and I want to get the not the usual suspects too.
Right.
To start talking and thinking about this with me. And so I'm going to spend the next couple of years working on that and see if we can come up with a blueprint for the next 40. What do we have to tackle? What do we have to change? What are the paradigm shifts that we need to either make happen or maybe already started that we have to get involved in?
Well, I can't tell you how much I admire the work you've done and just the person that you are. I mean, to say this is a good time in life, I know exactly what you mean. It is fulfilling, and yet new challenges all the time. I think people will have been wondering, supposing I need to contact somebody, so we're going to probably put up some, maybe a website and some phone numbers at the end of this show, certainly for Peace Over Violence and any other hotline or anything you think should go up. But Patti, thank you so very much for doing this. First of all, it's a great oral history of a wonderful leader, and I see the show very much as doing that. Members of our community who have done amazing work, each one of them, you know, deserving to be spotlighted, and I'm so glad I finally got to do your story on the show. Really, really good work. And thank you for being with us as well. The story of Patti Giggans is not the story of just one person, but a person who decided that he would take the next step and make a difference, and you can do it too. Get used to it.